All right. There is a new handout today. Does anybody need one still? Just raise your hand and I'll ask Brace if he can to give them to people. So we need one up here. Anybody else? There is enough for every single person to have one, so. Maybe two. Not really. We've been needing about 50 every time, so. All right. So we already started this packet, but we just really introduced it. So basically everything on page 1 we talked about on Wednesday. And this is the idea that in this class we've looked at what are called bedrock facts, minimal facts, different names for them. But basically the core, absolute, fundamental information about the message of Christianity from a historical perspective, that everybody who studies the subject professionally across the spectrum, whether they are believers of some kind or full-blown atheists, all of the professionals agree that these things are true. So we looked at 5 facts, and then we went into those facts to show why they're so certain and put some flesh on the bones of those. And we've said that those facts themselves don't explain what happened. They just state what happens, right? And so the explanation that we were assuming for all of it was exactly what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, which is our text that we're pulling all of this from. Again, historically speaking, the earliest record of what the disciples taught in the whole New Testament is probably in those verses there. And they said the explanation for all of those facts, that Jesus is real, that Jesus was crucified by the Romans, that the disciples sincerely believed that they saw him alive again, that Paul, the church persecutor, was transformed, that the tomb was empty, that the explanation for all of that is that Jesus was raised from the dead and then appeared to several hundred people to show that he was alive again. And that is what the earliest followers of Jesus said was the explanation for all of these facts. So you can see that, of course, in 1 Corinthians 15. You can see that in the sermons or the sermon summaries in the book of Acts, where from the very beginning they're saying this is what we witnessed and what we saw and why we're saying all of this. But of course, as we said, there's been other explanations that have been given. So even from the very beginning, there have been other theories that have been proposed to deny Jesus' resurrection and explain the facts in another way. And so in this part of the class, what we're doing is we're pivoting and not looking at the facts anymore, but we're using them then to evaluate other theories to explain them. And so the core facts and alternate explanations. So we talked a little bit about some of them. And we provided, I provided you a quotation. So that third paragraph down on page 1, I'm going to be reading where that quote starts in the middle of the paragraph again. So not everything that we're talking about is actually promoted by academics, scholars, whatever you want to call them, because a lot of them have been pretty much categorically disproved. But again, as we said, that doesn't stop someone from sharing it on TikTok or reading some kind of fringe book and thinking that they've unlocked the secret to the universe and showing that the resurrection is a conspiracy and all that kind of crazy stuff. But provided from 2 scholars here, the quotation, today, the prevalent view among sophisticated critics, that would be academics who do not believe in the resurrection, is that the disciples seem to have experienced something, but what it was may not be known. And the general bias is against resurrections. So something happened, the disciples saw something, but we can't really know what it is what they would say. And resurrections don't happen. And so we're not going to believe that. And so I said I'll add to that what's also commonly suggested is that whatever the disciples experienced, that they probably embellished or kind of developed a little bit. And so those are the 2 main ideas for those seeking alternate explanations beside the resurrection of Jesus. And so I said it'll help us to keep in mind the core facts we explored. So number 1, number 2, number 3, I've listed them like that because when we go through the questions, I'll have in parentheses, why did this happen, parentheses, fact number 3, or whatever. And so you can refer back to these really easily. So that's what we're going to be doing, and we'll talk about this idea on the bottom of page 1 that we left off with on Wednesday, and then start getting into some of these alternate theories. And I kind of just blazed through all of that to get us back up to speed. Is there any questions or anything left over from the last week that we want to talk about? Anybody feeling lost so far? You can just kind of raise your hand a little bit. Again, it's not you, it's me. All right. So everybody's on board. We know exactly what we're talking about. So the bottom of page 1, question number 1, we talked about this a little bit on Wednesday, but this is sort of where we left off. So it says, while Jesus was alive, he claimed to perform miracles. And that's what, the historical sources outside the Bible say too, that it was said that he was a miracle worker and all of those kinds of things. He also predicted that he would be killed and resurrected. And then he also claimed to be the Son of God. So all of that stuff being true, what kind of context then is Jesus setting for when we're looking for an explanation about what happened? So let's be thinking about that, and I want to read some of these texts. So let's go to Mark chapter 8. So be thinking about this question as we read through these. Part of why I'm going to Mark, just as kind of background for you, is it is generally agreed that Mark was the earliest of the Gospels that were written. So again, we're trying to get the earliest sources, things like that. Mark is the earliest and most straightforward, and it's probably the one that I know the best, which is why another reason I'm going to it. So let's go to Mark chapter 8, and we're going to look at verses 31 through 32 first. And to put in your perspective of the context, this is Jesus and the closest disciples, and they are walking toward Jerusalem in preparation for Jesus' crucifixion. So they started up basically way in Caesarea Philippi, way up north, and they're on this long journey toward Jerusalem for then the Passion Week, for lack of a better term right now. So Mark chapter 8, 31 and 32. Can somebody read that for us? Grace.
Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and experts in the law, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He spoke openly about this, so Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him.
Okay, so Jesus takes his followers sort of in private. He's using this opportunity to basically teach them this is what you need to know because something's about to happen and they don't understand. And it says that he starts to tell them what? In verse 31. What is he telling them?
The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed after 3 days rise again.
It's pretty straightforward, right? You would think. And it says he was saying this very plainly. They understood when he talked about the Son of Man that he was describing himself. That was his favorite nickname for himself, right? For a whole host of reasons, the Son of Man. And so he says, we're going to Jerusalem, and the leaders are going to kill me, but after 3 days I will rise again. And he's stating this very plainly, but obviously they don't understand. So let's go to Mark chapter 9, and we're going to look at verses 30 and 32, and this is the second time that he says this. So someone please read for us Mark 9, 30 through 32. Zach.
They went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know. For he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And then when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him.
Okay, thank you. So he repeats it, right? We're a little farther down the road. We're closer to Jerusalem. And he again says, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. When he's killed, after 3 days he will rise again. He's stating it very plainly. Do they understand what he's saying? No. And so one of the things that I want to point out is the fact that the gospel writers are showing the disciples did not understand. Again, we've talked about that principle of embarrassment. Shows that this is reliable. This is probably exactly what happened, right? Because he's saying, Jesus was saying this stuff, but it didn't make sense to anybody at the time. And so that shows that this is just a straightforward telling of what's going on. So let's look at the last time in Mark chapter 10, 32 through 34. So this is getting even closer, and then once basically they get to chapter 11 is when they enter into Jerusalem. So somebody read for us Mark 10, 32 through 34. Addie.
Now they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was going before them. And they were amazed, and as they followed, they were afraid. Then he took the 12 aside again and began to tell them the things that would happen to him. Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and to the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and scourge him and spit on him and kill him, and the third day he will rise again.
Okay, thank you. We got all the details here, right? He says, we're going to Jerusalem, and the chief priests are going to hand me over to the Gentiles, the Romans, and they're going to kill me, and then after 3 days I will rise again. And so basically all of this showing Jesus has full awareness of who he is. It is agreed that Jesus predicted that he would be killed, and that he gave these confusing statements about rising again, and nobody knew what he was talking about ahead of time. So when you look at that, you see that Jesus was predicting his death. Now let's go to Mark 14. Remember, this is the trial of Jesus in front of the Jewish council. So Mark 14, and if someone will read for us verses 61 through 62. Mark 14, 61 through 62. Josh, you got that?
But he kept silent and did not answer. Again the high priest was questioning him, and saying to him, Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus said, I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
Okay, so we don't have time to fully unpack that absolutely amazing statement that he makes there. But this is talking to the high priest, and the high priest asked him, because Jesus is not answering any of the charges that they're bringing against him, it's a two-part, are you the Christ, the Messiah, and are you the Son of the Blessed One? What does Son of the Blessed One mean? What is the high priest getting at?
He doesn't even choose to speak the name of God.
Right.
So he calls it the blessed.
Yeah, he's asking him very pointedly, are you the Son of God? But the Jews would not use the name of God. And what does Jesus say? Yes, I am. And then he adds some extra flavor to it and bringing in the idea of the Son of Man, which would essentially mean that he would sit co-regent on the throne of heaven, according to Daniel, things like that. And the high priest loses his mind, obviously, and says, you heard this blasphemy, let's kill this guy. He just said that he was the Son of God. And so, okay, all of this, Jesus is performing miracles. He's predicting that he is going to be killed and raised from the dead. And he's claiming to be the Son of God. So what kind of context is Jesus setting for all of the things that are about to happen and what we should look for in an explanation? Again, keep in mind, we said on Wednesday, this isn't saying George Washington came back from the dead just randomly. So what kind of context is Jesus setting here? Andrew.
He's laying out events that are going to be outside of his control when they occur, but he's being very plain and very direct in what they're going to be. This isn't some Nostradamus saying where after he's dead and raised, then they can so direct that you can't say that Jesus wasn't aware of the events that were going to happen and was directly pointing to them.
He's claiming to predict exactly what's going to happen. Ed, did you have your hand up?
I was just gonna add that he is stating by what power that these things are gonna happen.
Yeah, he's claiming some supernatural stuff's about to happen. It's been happening already. But again, he's saying this is what's going to happen. He's predicting it. He's saying that these things are divine, they're supernatural. So that's bringing in a whole other religious context, right? And then Greg, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was, believe it or not, listening to a story about Larry Bird, such a big sports fan.
How are you going to connect this? Okay.
But they said, I can connect this. They said he was one of the biggest trash talkers ever to play the game.
Yeah.
And he would tell opponents, I'm going to go in the corner. They're going to pass me the ball. I'm going to do a jump shot. There's nothing you can do about it. And people said he was such an arrogant man. And then others would say, but he delivered. He always did what he said he was going to do. He told us, and then he did it. So is that arrogance or is that power? So just having heard that conversation made me think, some people are going, how arrogant, and that was the high priest's reaction. Not only arrogant, but arrogant against God, which
Yeah.
is blasphemy. And others would have heard that and say, I can't believe he would talk like that. Here's Jesus who's been such a humble man all these years that we've known him, and here he's talking trash.
Yeah, basically. This is what's going to happen, and this is what I'm going to do, and absolutely. Yes, Jim.
You can see why Peter said what he said. Well, Peter knew his power. He knew he was the Son of God. And what Jesus told Peter down there sounded like a confession of defeat.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, they were saying, yeah, we understand exactly what's going on, and still Jesus is throwing curveballs at them, right? Okay, yeah, so when we're looking at this, Jesus is saying this is what's going to happen. These aren't random events. He's saying this is what's going to happen. Then when you look at the facts, it looks like that's exactly what happened. That's what Jesus said. He's saying there are supernatural, divine things going on. And so he is saying this is the way that you need to be examining and looking at this. Again, it's not random. It's not, okay, somebody in 1850 saw George Washington come out of the grave just randomly out of nowhere. Jesus is laying out exactly our expectations and what's going to happen. So he is directing us and looking for an explanation about all this. So we have to keep that in mind, that Jesus is setting the stage for all of this. Do we have any questions before we move on? Yes, Chad.
It also shows us that God's in control.
Yeah.
That God foretold this previously, and Jesus proclaimed it too, and that it's the way it happened.
Yep. Jesus said this is what's going to happen, and then it happens, and then he says, here, let me show you how this actually goes all the way back to the beginning, and it was always going to be this way. And they didn't understand it until that, right? Okay, so let's turn to page 2 here, and we're going to start looking at the alternate theories. So in general, it's been proposed before that this was just a fraud. Okay, Jesus didn't actually raise from the dead. It was some kind of conspiracy. And so we'll look at a couple examples of that. And so, one of the most straightforward ways to deny the resurrection is to just say, well, it's not true. It didn't actually happen like that. And there are multiple ways that it can be claimed that it's a fraud. And so this first one we've already looked at before, and it is the claim that the disciples stole the body. So just in general, the first ever alternate explanation provided to explain what was happening with Jesus' followers was that the disciples stole the body. So that's what was being said. And then in order to combat this story of the empty tomb and the things that were happening, the Jewish leaders start to tell people, well, actually his followers stole his body. And so that's what we have recorded here in Matthew 28, 12 through 15. There on page 2. Can somebody read that for us just to remind us? We talked about this before. Somebody read Matthew 28, 12 through 15. Jeff, can you do that?
And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, tell people his disciples came by night and stole stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day.
Okay, just to remind us of a couple things. So this is the first ever recorded objection or opposing theory to the resurrection in the exact days that it was happening. Okay? And again, even if someone doesn't want to believe what Matthew is saying about this, he is addressing the fact that the Jews are claiming in their day that the disciples stole the body. And so if the Jews are claiming that the disciples stole the body, what are they trying to explain? The body is not there. So Matthew's saying, let me set the record straight. This was all a conspiracy that they derived. But regardless of if you believe what Matthew says about that, the point is still that in that time period, the Jews were claiming the disciples stole the body, showing that the body was not there. And so then moving into this about these questions, so you notice, as I said before, I'll ask the question and then I'll give you the fact that you need to think about in order to answer the question. So right, I said before that it might seem kind of scary or a little bit anxiety-inducing to think about some of these theories, but if you know the key facts, it is actually very easy to show why these are not very good explanations. So number one, we'll start. How does this theory fail to explain the sincere belief of the disciples in seeing Jesus alive again? And in saying that, we're referring back to fact number 3. And I realize you have not had this until today because I could not stop writing and just print it. So I'll give you a second to think about it. Andrew.
I think it's been said a few times in this class that people don't die for something that they know is a fabrication.
Right.
And I'm honestly, I've kind of toyed with that statement whether or not I fully agree with it or not. I feel like you can most likely find examples of people who died for a lie that they crafted.
Right.
So I'm not sure that that's an always true theorem of human behavior per se. But the fact that they suffered so much and lost so much for this story, there appears to be nothing for them to have gained if this was a false story.
Right. So you could, like you were saying at the first part, you could point out, like it was on Wednesday, David Koresh, Jim Jones, people who died for things they knew was wrong. But in the case of people suffering and losing things as a result, it shows that their belief is sincere. It doesn't show that what they believe is true, right? Because we brought up, what about, terrorists who strap themselves with bombs? We would say that they're definitely sincere in their belief, but we would not say that they're correct in their belief, right? But the fact that the disciples had so much to lose, and they did lose, shows that they really, truly believe this. I think I had Greg and then Brace.
So you have to give consideration that the leaders of the movement, the apostles and the disciples, may not have been the ones responsible for stealing the body. It could have been someone that had a motive to try to discredit them by punking them or something of that effect. Let's just say that they were not aware the body was stolen. But then you still have to say it's either mass hysteria or mass hypnosis or some other explanation for why they would have this sincere belief they saw him. It's not just that, well, Jesus is risen. It's I have seen the risen Jesus. And missing body or not, that's a further statement of conviction than just, well, he's not in the ground, so he must be walking around somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about more of that in a few moments. So I don't want to dismiss you, of course, but we will get there. Bryce.
Well, we talked about the fact that early on, they didn't believe the reports that the tomb was empty. When they went and looked, they weren't sure why it was empty. And they didn't believe Jesus' statements in the first place. So why would they steal the body in order to fabricate a story about him rising from the dead when they didn't even believe it? And so it doesn't fit with at least the reports from the Gospels about not only their response to Jesus' teaching, but their initial response to the report that the tomb was empty. And so it just doesn't fit with the facts that are revealed in the records that we have. So.
Right. And so to jump off of what you're saying, when we're looking at these, right, we're showing that to claim this theory, it doesn't explain the key facts. It doesn't explain the key information very well. Jesse?
Well, something else in this too, they even proved that it could not be false. The government, if their subordinates did anything that was against their rules, they failed in their tasks or whatever at those times, they'd have been instantly put to death. And they weren't put to death, they were told to tell a lie.
Yeah.
So, I mean, people seeing the guards that had supposedly, oh yeah, we split, that's not gonna happen, and they know that.
Yeah. So really important, like we said, and we'll talk about again. The disciples are claiming all of this stuff in the same exact place where all the events took place. So again, they're saying all these things happened where he was buried, where he was killed. And if it was some big conspiracy that could be proven to be false, it would have happened right there, right? Jim, you had your hand.
How can them soldiers testify to anything while they're asleep? That could not have been a problem, see, that could bring the death penalty. What it boiled down to was they were hired, bribed, liars.
Yeah. That is definitely a question I've thought of before. Yeah, how would they know the disciples stole the body if they were sleeping? But, okay. So I want to share a quote with you that talks about what we're discussing. So we said in one of the facts, I don't remember, we mentioned the name Eusebius. You remember that? So basically he was an early church historian. So in the early 300s or so, he was writing a lot of things about the history of the church. But he wrote a book where he talks about exactly what we're saying of, you know, to say that the disciples or somebody stole the body does not explain the information. So he proposes this account of the conspiracy, right? And it's satire. You know, he's being sarcastic. So he says, let us band together, the speaker proclaims, you know, whoever decides, let's come up with this conspiracy. Let us band together, the speaker proclaims, to invent all the miracles and resurrection appearances which we never saw unless carry the sham even to death. Why not die for nothing? Why dislike torture and whipping inflicted for no good reason? Let us go out to all nations and overthrow their institutions and denounce their gods. And even if we don't convince anybody, at least we'll have the satisfaction of drawing down on ourselves the punishment for our own deceit. And so to say that the disciples created this conspiracy, you have to say that that's what they're doing. Yeah, let's do this for no reason. Let's go to all of the nations and claim that these things happened and be punished and die even though we're not going to gain anything from it. They didn't get fame and fortune. And if we want to say that that was their intent, then they failed miserably. Brace.
Not to be rude, but I mean, you're giving the disciples far more credit than they deserve. I mean, highly intelligent men have tried to fabricate frauds and conspiracies unsuccessfully. These are not the brightest bulbs on the tree. These are not the cream of the crop.
Right.
And to credit them with ultimately coming up with what would be the greatest fraud and conspiracy in the history of mankind is frankly giving them more credit than they deserve.
Absolutely. Jesse, did you have your hand up? Or?
No.
Okay. So I want to go off of what Brace is saying to number 2 here. So in saying that this conspiracy would have happened, how likely is it that the disciples would have been able to pull off a conspiracy of stealing the body and then fabricating the resurrection? And so we're referring back to fact number 3, their sincere belief, and then the fact of the empty tomb. So Brace brought up the fact that they're uneducated peasants, right? These are fishermen. These are just regular guys. They're not even rabbis. You know, they're not theologians. They're not super educated. So there's that. What other kinds of things can we think about to bear on the fact of how likely this would have been or not.
There were a lot of moving pieces and a lot of people involved in this. So to get them all on the same page would have been highly unlikely.
Yeah,
To get the story consistent.
like Bryce said, I fully agree with this. If the disciples stole the body and they fabricated this conspiracy, they pulled off the largest conspiracy in the history of the world. Because think about the effects of what they were saying. That has changed the course of the world more than anything else. And 12 random Jewish guys pulled that off, apparently. That would be the biggest conspiracy in the history of the world. I got, I think, Chet and then Brace.
Thought come to me, if it was conspiracy, how could they get 500 people to agree to it that they've seen Jesus walking on the earth when he appeared to the 500?
Yeah, that would have been extreme persuasion, that's for sure. Brace?
I've said a lot.
Okay.
I was just gonna say, they would also have to be stealthy ninjas
Yeah,
to get in there and get the body with all of the soldiers around the tomb.
that's why we're referring to fact number 5, right? We saw examples of the tombs. You know, that rock is several hundred pounds. So it was a high-profile death, right? That's why they staged guards there, because they said this guy claimed he was going to rise from the dead, so let's put guards there and make sure that that doesn't happen, that nobody comes and steals his body. And so there's a team of guards there. The stones were sealed, right? It's hundreds of pounds. Is it going to be quiet to roll a rock like that? No. There's just so many things that don't make sense. As you add more and more of the details, it's just so unlikely that that would have been able to happen.
Your writer from the 300s said it really humorous, but you don't, no conspirator joins the conspiracy unless there's something in it for themselves.
Right.
And that's just human nature. And
Yeah.
every conspiracy has been, whether it's perceived to be political power or a chance for money or some kind of payoff, some kind of reward, they don't just volunteer for torture, abuse, and being chased across the country as criminals.
Unless they're absolutely insane,
Yeah.
right? And we would have to say that all of these guys were completely off their rocker to say that they pulled that off. Whichever of you was first. Okay. Here.
As he's walking along and telling the disciples this is going to happen, and they're not understanding, they're confused, and they're each given this little piece of puzzle, and I can see them all getting together and like, what's going on? This just happened. And it would be really weird for us, hey, let's all go steal the body. That it doesn't make sense with the actions that supposedly happened and how they were confused. There's just
Yeah.
a disconnect there. It's not logical.
They were confused by everything that Jesus did. They were confused when the body was missing. They were confused when he appeared to them. They were confused after he appeared to them and had been with them for over a month.
So why would they steal the body?
Right. Okay.
That makes no sense.
They had somebody over here. Was it Brace?
The gospel accounts don't give evidence of being a fabricated story that they rehearsed and seek to spread that message. I mean, they're much better explained by 4 perspectives
Yeah.
of people who are just accounting for the same facts.
Yeah, we pointed out over and over again that when you look at the accounts, they're just very straightforward in the way they're telling the story. They give what we say are incidental details. So things that are just matter of fact in telling what happened for them, but then when you look at them, it really puts together the fact that this is a reliable story. Oh, sorry, Jesse, forgot you.
Sorry. And something else we need to realize in all this, how many people were involved in
Yeah.
this? Not only that, it's humanly impossible if something's fabricated for people to keep the one story together. It's been proven over and over and over again, and it's always fallen apart somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
So how
I mean, Watergate, whatever you want to bring up. But there is no record anywhere, seriously, no record anywhere in history of any of these core people ever recanting or going back on what they said. It's just not there. And if it was a conspiracy, I mean, essentially every other conspiracy has always fallen apart. Somebody has said something. You know, when one of these guys are in another country being tortured to death, again, it's just human nature for these things to come out. And there's no record anywhere of that ever happening with any of them.
Is there any identification on who was the leader of the conspiracy?
He usually said it was Peter, because he was influential, right? So he usually said that Peter came up with it, or Peter hallucinated or something, and then he convinced the rest of them to go along with it. The same guy who ran away all those times when Jesus was arrested and on trial and all that. So, Andrew.
Because Peter was so unstable, of course. I'm just trying to think what someone who's bent on finding reason not to believe this might say. And I was trying to search for what could they thought that they might have been gaining by creating this story. Because I agree with what Dan said, that people don't buy into a conspiracy and promote a conspiracy unless they think they have something to gain. We talked about the criterion of embarrassment, and I wondered, what's more embarrassing to mention, yeah, we didn't believe him when he said it, we didn't understand the prophecies when he said it, or is it more embarrassing to go back to being a fisherman who's now a disgraced fisherman who followed a false teacher? And I'm just wondering from there, a critic might say, well, their motivation was, we've sunk so much into this, we can't go back. We can't endure the shame of having been duped by this false teacher and admitting that. So in desperation, let's try to preserve what following we've got so far. We've got a couple hundred people, who are sympathetic to us. Let's do something to try to entrench our leadership with this group, and maybe we'll use this movement as a shield to the persecution that might follow.
I would understand why someone would say that. But we also have to keep in mind the historical context of the fact that this kind of thing happened all the time. Jewish messiahs would rise up and they would gain followers, and then they would be killed. And every other single time, except for in the case of Jesus, the people just went back to their normal lives, never to be heard from again. It literally happened dozens of times. There's even an example in the later 100s. It's called, you might have heard of it, the Simon Bar Kokhba revolts. He was a guy that claimed to be the Messiah and fought against the Romans and literally had an army. And they fought some battles against the Romans. People were that invested that they took up arms to defend the idea that this guy was Messiah. And the Romans stamped it down and everybody went back, never to be heard from again. So I understand why people would say that, of like, oh, we have so much invested in this, but this kind of thing happened all the time, and what people did was they just went back to their lives. Because really that was the best option instead of taking it to death. Greg, do you have any?
Well, yeah, if the conspirator, the so-called conspirators, if the disciples and the apostles, as they were firmly convicted, was that Jesus was going to lead them in a revolt against the Romans and be successful.
It's ultimately what they thought was happening, yeah.
Then they became conspirators in order to lay down their swords and talk the Romans to death instead of taking up arms. They didn't pursue the same belief that they had prior to the resurrection.
Yeah.
They changed their mind entirely as they began to understand when Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. So they weren't even conspirators in the sense that they were like all the other messiahs, because all the messiahs were political, military movements.
Yeah.
And this one was pacifist.
Because that was, for one thing, that was the understanding of the Messiah from the Old Testament that the Jews had at the time. That he was going to be a military leader that was going to lead a revolt and reestablish Israel. And so even after Jesus is raised from the dead, what did they say in Acts chapter 1 right before the ascension? Are you now going to restore the kingdom back to Israel? because this is obviously what you're supposed to do. And he just basically says, you don't need to worry about all that, because you still don't understand. Bryce, is that where you're...
None of this actually explains why Paul, a prominent Jewish...
That's question 4, right?
I mean, none of it explains why Paul would have been duped by this conspiracy
Yeah.
to leave his prominence in Judaism to go and follow a movement that ultimately led to his death.
Yeah, so let's look at question 4, and then we'll go back to 3. So yeah, Bryce just opened it. Does the disciples stealing the body of Jesus, would that explain the transformation that occurred in Paul of Tarsus? Not at all. I mean, if you think about it, that's probably what he thought happened, actually. Paul probably did think that the disciples stole the body. And because of that conspiracy, he was trying to kill all of them. That's why he was hunting him down. I mean, that would be the most likely explanation, right? Paul of Tarsus knew that the body was not in the tomb. That was common knowledge, very clearly, historically. And so Paul probably did think that these people stole the body, and we still have his transformation, right? And a lot of that is because he said, I saw Jesus myself. It wasn't based on anything they said. It was his own personal experience of it, right? So let's get to number 3 real quick then, too. Was the disciples' belief just based solely on a missing body? So the claim that the disciples stole the body and then they were saying, oh, Jesus was risen from the dead, was their belief just based on a body not being in the tomb? No. What was their belief based on?
They saw him, they tested him.
He appeared to us. Yeah, we talked to him. We heard him. We ate with him. We touched him. And that's why we're saying this. Not just because the tomb was empty, right?
Do you think at that point they were like, I guess you did tell us you were going to do this? Like,
But it also seems like they didn't understand it until Pentecost, really.
yeah.
And that's
I
kind
guess
of
that's
the amazing thing, right?
Yeah.
Andrew?
It's just a cascading, it loads on more and more and more things that have to be part of this fabrication.
Right,
Not
yes.
only is it the resurrection story they have to make up, well, now they have to make up the interactions they had with him after he raised. Well, they also believed him because of the miracles he did during his life. So they've got to make up those too, or else is there any credit to those? So that has to be thrown into the story. Jesus' theology might as well be thrown into the story because it was so transgressive and so different from Jewish theology. You run into, they had to invent a whole religion to prop this up, if that's the case.
12 random guys from Galilee, right? And that's the thing too, is you have to then come up with how were these guys able to bring up this radically new belief in the crucified, risen Messiah that was a good thing, and then show that all of this was the correct interpretive lens of the Old Testament. I mean, it's just absolutely massive to say that they would have been able to come up with all of this. Okay, so we will get into this idea of someone else stole the body on Wednesday. Does anyone have anything to say or to ask before we end? Okay, thank you. There was a lot of participation. Thank you very much.